Having explored the fundamental biological mechanisms that underpin our cognition, we now turn our attention to a fascinating extension: how consciousness itself can be extended, shaped by memory and self-awareness. We'll look at conditions where this extension falters, revealing the intricate layers of what it means to be conscious. Let's start with a real-world example: a patient experiencing transient global amnesia (TGA). Think of it like suddenly having a major blank spot in your personal history, but only for a short time. This woman had a mild episode. She felt a bit off, unsure about her old friends, panicked momentarily about signing in for lunch, and even hesitated with her social security number. It was unsettling, but she managed to get through it. The key takeaway here is that while her autobiographical self, her sense of who she was and what had happened recently, was temporarily wiped clean, her core consciousness remained intact. She could still think clearly, organize her thoughts, and behave appropriately. Later, she realized she'd been misreading her calendar. That's the hallmark of TGA. The recent past just vanishes, leaving a penumbra around it. Crucially, this is worlds apart from epileptic automatism, where someone might act like a zombie. Here, despite the memory loss, she was fully awake, attentive, and emotionally engaged. It's a stark reminder that consciousness isn't just about being aware. It's about the layers of self-awareness built on memory. So TGA involves a temporary wipeout of recent autobiographical memory. Now, let's compare that to post-traumatic amnesia (PTA), which often follows head injuries. PTA can be much more severe and longer lasting. Consider patient D thrown from a horse. He lost consciousness for about 10 minutes. When he woke up, he was confused, agitated, asking what's going on. He looked at the faces around him and couldn't make heads or tails of them, nor did he recognize himself. It's like waking up in a completely different reality. Gradually, bits returned. He noticed his jogging clothes and declared, "I want to go running." That was his original intention before the accident. Only later in the ambulance did his full sense of identity snap back into place. What's fascinating here is the neurological journey he took in under an hour. From something akin to deep anesthesia or coma, through a state resembling akinetic mutism or automatism, wakefulness without core consciousness, into a TGA-like state, core consciousness back, but no extended consciousness, and finally, full recovery. It paints a vivid picture of these different levels of consciousness and how they can be selectively impaired. This erosion of the extended self isn't just seen in acute events like TGA or PTA. It's a gradual process in Alzheimer's disease. As memory fades, especially the autobiographical kind, the person's sense of self, their unique life story, starts to dissolve. This happens before the deeper, more fundamental core consciousness begins to fade away. The text describes a poignant example. A patient sees his wife, smiles warmly, but doesn't recognize her. His wife gently reminds him, "I am your wife." And his response? A simple matter-of-fact question. "And who am I?" No panic, no confusion, just genuine curiosity. This shows that even in late-stage Alzheimer's, a tiny spark of the autobiographical self, the inquisitive mode, might still flicker. But the ability to construct the narrative of one's life, the extended consciousness, is gone. The disease has stripped away the layers of self built on memory, leaving behind the barest essence of being, which will eventually fade too. Now let's talk about something truly bizarre: anosognosia. The name itself is telling, a meaning no, nosos meaning disease, gnosis meaning knowledge. So it's literally the inability to recognize one's own illness. The classic case is a stroke victim, paralyzed on one side, completely unable to move arm, leg, face, yet utterly convinced nothing is wrong. They genuinely say, "I feel fine." This phenomenon was first described by Babinski over a century ago. For a long time, people tried to explain it away psychologically. Maybe it's denial, an adaptive coping mechanism. But the author argues convincingly against this. Why? Because consider the mirror image situation. If the right side is paralyzed due to a stroke, the patient is usually perfectly aware of their condition. Anosognosia is almost exclusively linked to damage in the right hemisphere of the brain. It's not just psychological denial, it's a specific neurological deficit caused by damage to particular brain regions. It's a striking example of impaired extended consciousness. The person knows their body state, but the higher level integration needed for self-awareness of that state is broken. How does this work? Let's look at patient DJ. With complete left side paralysis, she'd confidently insist her left arm was fine. Ask her to move it. She'd search for it, confront the limp limb, and ask if you really wanted it moved. Only after repeated insistence would she reluctantly admit, "It doesn't seem to do much by itself." Even then, she'd immediately use her good hand to move the bad one, stating the obvious. It's astounding. The damage isn't just in the primary motor cortex. It's in a complex network in the right hemisphere involving areas like the insula, parietal cortex areas 3, 1, 2, and S2, plus their connections. The hypothesis is that this network creates the most comprehensive integrated map of the current body state. Damaged here disrupts this high-level representation, impacting the proto-self's awareness of the whole organism. It's not just a sensory issue, it's a breakdown in the highest level of self-monitoring related to the body. Interestingly, this also explains why patients struggle to remember being told they're paralyzed, suggesting a deeper issue with integrating new information into the flawed self-model. Related to this is asomatognosia, literally lack of recognition of the body. Patient LB had a small stroke affecting part of her right somatosensory cortex, specifically area S2. This didn't cause permanent paralysis or emotional issues, but she developed seizures. During these episodes, she'd lose awareness of her body's physical presence. She knew she was thinking, she could feel her heartbeat, but she couldn't feel her limbs or torso. She'd pinch herself, initially feeling nothing, then slowly sensation would return. Her description was simple, a funny feeling like I couldn't feel my body. Importantly, she remained oriented, knew who she was and where she was. She was alert, just disconnected from her physical form. The interpretation here is that the seizure temporarily shut down the highest level integration of body signals in the right hemisphere. However, lower level SIDS from the brainstem, hypothalamus, and the left hemisphere counterparts were still active enough to maintain a basic sense of being, a proto-self foundation, allowing her core consciousness to persist. It highlights the critical role of the right hemisphere's somatosensory cortex in constructing our embodied sense of self. Beyond these neurological cases, the concept of impaired extended consciousness can also shed light on psychiatric conditions, though the interpretations are necessarily more tentative. Think about working memory deficits often seen after frontal lobe damage. If you can't hold many things in mind at once, you can't easily weave together the threads of past experiences and future plans needed for complex, meaningful actions. Your extended consciousness is limited. In psychiatry, consider mania. Perhaps the autobiographical self inflates, leading to grandiose thinking. Conversely, severe depression might involve shrinking the self, focusing only on negative aspects. Schizophrenia symptoms like thought insertion or hearing voices could potentially be viewed as disruptions in the flow of autobiographical narratives, creating anomalous selves and memories. Conditions like depersonalization, where you feel detached from yourself, or the controversial diagnosis of multiple personality disorder, might also involve fractures or distortions in the autobiographical self. It's a framework that suggests these conditions might involve different ways the extended consciousness goes awry. To understand altered extended consciousness, the author uses the analogy of an orchestra score. Imagine observing someone with impaired extended consciousness versus someone with intact consciousness. The observer sees a different behavioral score. The person is awake, can perform routine tasks, maybe even show basic emotions. But when it comes to complex behaviors requiring detailed knowledge of the past or future, planning a multi-step project, understanding nuanced social cues based on history, they falter. These specific actions and their associated emotions are missing. Internally, the cognitive score tells a similar story. The person feels awake, feels like they're perceiving things, feels alive. But the richer layers of meaning, the sense of self derived from a rich autobiographical tapestry, are just not accessible. It's like hearing the basic melody but missing the harmonies and counterpoint. The mind is sensing life, but it's not really examining it, not connecting the present moment to the grand narrative of the self. The autobiographical self is impoverished, so the extended consciousness lacks depth. This brings us to a classic philosophical puzzle posed by William James. How can our self feel continuous over time, even though every moment of consciousness is fleeting and constantly changing? The proposed solution here is elegant. There isn't just one self but two distinct, yet closely linked entities. First, there's the ever-changing core self, the raw stream of experience, moment by moment. It's transient, needing constant renewal. Think of it as the water flowing in a river. Second, there's the seemingly permanent autobiographical self. This is built on our memories, our personal history. It provides the sense of continuity, the feeling that I am the same person yesterday as today. It's like the riverbed that gives the river its identity. To have both selves, you need both core consciousness for the ever-present core self and conventional memory for the autobiographical self. Working memory then allows us to bring that autobiographical self into focus within our extended consciousness. So, creatures with very limited memory wouldn't experience James's paradox in the same way. They wouldn't have the autobiographical self providing that sense of enduring sameness. Let's zoom in on core consciousness. It's described as a central resource, produced by a relatively compact system in the brain, despite needing many parts to function. Think of it as a hub, not spread thinly across the entire brain. Its robustness comes from this centrality and its versatility. Any kind of mental content, whether perceived or recalled, can trigger it. It's not specialized for vision or hearing. It's a general-purpose system used by all modalities to generate knowledge. And crucially, it's deeply intertwined with the autobiographical self. Every time core consciousness pulses in response to something, relevant autobiographical memories are also reactivated, feeding back into the stream of consciousness. You need autobiographical memory for that sense of past and future, of continuity. But you absolutely need core consciousness to know anything about the present moment, the object of attention, or the memory being accessed. They are mutually supportive, a beautiful interlock. Core consciousness is the bedrock, the foundational must, upon which the edifice of extended consciousness is built. Where in the brain does the autobiographical self reside? The author uses the image space versus dispositional space framework. Image space is where conscious mental images arise, likely linked to early sensory cortices and limbic areas. Dispositional space holds the implicit records, the blueprints for generating images and actions found in higher-order cortices and subcortical nuclei, perhaps in convergence zones. Memories aren't stored in one neat file cabinet, they're distributed. Think of the memory of a hammer, shape in visual cortex, movement in motor cortex, word in language areas, all separate yet coordinated for seamless recall. The same applies to autobiographical memories. Our personal history is stored across relevant higher-order regions, temporal, frontal, amygdala, etc., linked by thalamus, and held temporarily by prefrontal working memory. The autobiographical self emerges when this distributed network activates, coordinating memories of identity, recent events, and anticipated futures. These explicit images pop up in early cortices, are sustained by working memory, and become known to the core self via core consciousness pulses. It's a dynamic process, not a static storage location. So, what does this mean for identity and personhood? The argument is that these concepts hinge on the autobiographical self. Personality isn't just innate traits, it's shaped by our unique life experiences, recorded in autobiographical memory. This is the foundation of our personhood. Think of it as a combination. Some traits are genetically predisposed or early learned temperament, but the bulk of personality develops through our interactions with the world, guided by culture and education. These experiences are sedimented into autobiographical memory, shaping how we react consistently across situations. Neurologically, this involves complex circuits across the brain, convergent zones directing responses involving sensory images, motor actions, and emotions. Mature personality likely reflects well-organized interconnected control sites, allowing for consistent, sometimes complex, responses. This underlying consistency, this organized response pattern derived from a lifetime of lived experience, is what we perceive as stable identity. It's the autobiographical self giving us the sense of being a coherent individual. Our sense of self, this autobiographical self, isn't static. It's constantly being updated. Imagine convergence zones, continuously activating records of who we are, our family, friends, places, constantly refreshing our background awareness. Does this constant neural activity burn out neurons? Probably not in the way we think. Think of the heart muscle cells constantly contracting. They don't get tired in that way. Much of this self-building and remodeling likely happens non-consciously. Our current self is the result of years of experience, filtered through innate biases, acquired traits, intelligence, knowledge, and heavily influenced by our environment. It's a dynamic balance between the weight of our lived past and the pull of our anticipated future, our goals, desires, obligations. Each moment we construct an occasion of personhood, shaping our attitudes and choices. We have the potential for multiple selves, like Hamlet or Falstaff, but there's a powerful tendency towards unity. Evolutionarily, having one unified self makes survival easier. While imagination prepares multiple drafts, the biological machinery tends to select for continuity, keeping us anchored to a single, historically continuous self most of the time. This leads us to the vast dark dungeon of the unconscious. We're not consciously aware of countless things related to our memory. We don't know which memories are stored, how they're organized, classified, or linked. We don't control their strength or recallability. We experience the content of autobiographical memories, but the processes behind them are largely non-conscious. Some memories might remain submerged forever, never fully reconstructed, or only surfacing indirectly through other memories or emotions. Think of it like having a massive library. You know the books exist, but you don't know the exact filing system, how they're categorized, or how they connect to each other. The psychoanalytic unconscious touches on this, focusing on tangled psychological connections within autobiographical memory. But the non-conscious realm is far broader. It includes all unattended images, neural patterns that never become images, dormant dispositions, quiet remodeling, and even innate wisdom. It's an astonishingly large part of our mental landscape that remains unknown to our conscious selves. Let's briefly touch on nature versus nurture, applying it to our consciousness framework. The machinery for core consciousness, the proto-self, and the generation of the core self is likely heavily controlled by genes. The genome sets up the essential neural circuits for reliable function throughout life. However, the development of the autobiographical self is a different story. While the genetic blueprint provides the initial structure and enables learning, the actual content and maturation of autobiographical memory are profoundly shaped by the environment. Reward and punishment schedules, cultural rules, the specific knowledge we acquire, all these environmental factors regulate how the autobiographical self develops. It's like having the same house frame, genetic, but the interior design and furnishings, autobiographical content, vary greatly depending on the occupant's life. The autobiographical self is where our unique cultural history, our individual experiences, and our sense of self as a distinct human being truly come together. Extended consciousness, with its rich autobiographical layer, unlocks some of humanity's most remarkable abilities. Creating tools, understanding others' minds, feeling collective consciousness, suffering consciously rather than just reacting to pain, valuing life, distinguishing good from evil beyond mere pleasure or pain, considering others' interests, appreciating beauty, and even detecting discord leading to a sense of truth, these all rely on this extended capacity. Two stand out: the ability to transcend basic survival instincts and the critical capacity to detect inconsistencies, driving the search for truth and the creation of norms and ideals. These, the author argues, are the pinnacle of human distinctiveness and are precisely what conscience captures. Consciousness, in its core and extended forms, is necessary but not sufficient for conscience. It's the final link in a long chain, starting from basic neural signaling, building up to proto-self, core self, autobiographical self, extended consciousness, and culminating in the complex phenomenon of conscience. It's interesting to reflect on how humans have historically approached these concepts. We seem to have grappled with conscience long before consciousness became a central topic. Ancient myths and philosophies, like the Iliad where Athena stops Achilles, focus on moral dilemmas, conscience. Solon advising know thyself hints at self-awareness, but the modern concept of consciousness wasn't there. Plato and Aristotle had terms like nous and psyche, but they didn't quite capture our current understanding. The intense focus on consciousness is relatively recent, perhaps only gaining prominence in the last few centuries. Even the language evolved differently. In English, inwit appeared early, while conscience, from gathering knowledge, was used centuries before consciousness. Shakespeare in Hamlet clearly meant conscience when he spoke of it making cowards. Interestingly, Romance languages often use the same word, conscience, for both, blurring the lines, whereas Germanic languages have distinct terms. It suggests our understanding likely developed from the more accessible, culturally salient aspects like conscience, moving towards the more elusive core mechanisms. So, where does our current understanding stand? The author posits a hierarchy of mystery. We likely understand the workings of conscience best, followed by extended consciousness, with core consciousness remaining the deepest enigma. Research into the neurobiology of ethics, change or consciousness, and society Ornstein informs our grasp of conscience. Work on consciousness itself Dennett bars, Newman helps with extended consciousness. But cracking the code of core consciousness might be the key to unlocking the others. The remainder of this discussion aims to test the neuroanatomical hypotheses laid out earlier using existing evidence from neuroscience. Let's examine the predictions. Here are the core hypotheses again, linking specific brain structures to aspects of consciousness. 1. Damage to the somatosensory maps forming the proto-self should disrupt consciousness, especially if the damage is bilateral and located lower down in the brainstem. 2. Bilateral damage to structures involved in the second-order account like certain thalamic nuclei and cingulate cortex should impair core consciousness. 3. Bilateral damage to temporal cortices or prefrontal regions involved in autobiographical memory should reduce the scope of extended consciousness without affecting core consciousness. 4. Bilateral hippocampal damage should stop new autobiographical learning, altering future extended consciousness, but not current core consciousness. 5. Bilateral damage to primary sensory cortices, like vision or hearing, shouldn't impair core consciousness, except for the specific information those cortices process. Somatosensory cortex is an exception as it's part of the proto-self. 6. Even extensive bilateral prefrontal damage shouldn't alter core consciousness. Now, let's see how well these hold up against the evidence. Let's assess hypothesis 1. Does damage to the proto-self structures, primarily the somatosensory maps, disrupt consciousness? The clearest evidence comes from coma and the persistent vegetative state, PVS. A comatose patient looks asleep, but it's not sleep. They won't wake up to normal stimuli. They're alive, breathing, heart beating, but wakefulness, emotion, attention, purposeful behavior, all suspended. The inference is clear. Consciousness is suspended. PVS is a step further. Patients cycle through periods resembling sleep and wakefulness. Their EEG might show wakefulness patterns, and they might open their eyes. But crucially, this doesn't mean consciousness has returned. It only means wakefulness has returned. Emotion, attention, purposeful action still absent. The reasonable assumption is that consciousness remains suspended, although there are rare exceptions where it might return later. These states strongly suggest that the neural substrate for consciousness, including the proto-self, is critically damaged. What causes coma in PVS? Typically, it's damage to a tiny critical region in the posterior part of the upper brainstem, roughly from the mid-pons up to the midbrain and hypothalamus. This area is packed with vital pathways connecting the spinal cord and higher brain centers, plus numerous small nuclei controlling life functions and consciousness. The damage consistently hits several families of nuclei. There are the classical reticular nuclei known for wakefulness control, but also non-classical ones like monoamine nuclei locus ceruleus, VTA, SN, RAFE, acetylcholine parabrachial nuclei, and periaqueductal gray, sometimes grouped under reticular formation. The colliculi might also be affected. Does this support hypothesis 1? Yes, because the damage hits both the known wakefulness centers and the proto-self-related structures. While some argue it's just the classical reticular nuclei, the anatomical proximity and functional interconnection make it hard to separate. Plus, some comatose patients have normal EEGs, complicating that simpler explanation. Damage to the upper midbrain or hypothalamus, areas also rich in proto-self structures, also fits the hypothesis. It points towards a disruption in this critical brainstem region impacting consciousness. Now here's a fascinating contrast: locked-in syndrome LIS. Patients with LIS lose voluntary movement, often due to a stroke in the brainstem, but they remain fully conscious. It often starts suddenly, looks just like coma, and is initially mistaken for it. But the crucial difference is that the patient is aware. They can see, hear, and feel, but they can't move or speak. They are trapped inside their own body. What's remarkable is that the lesions causing LIS are typically located just millimeters away from the regions that cause coma. The spared area includes the critical wakefulness centers. This provides powerful evidence for hypothesis 1. Damage to that specific brainstem region disrupts consciousness coma, while damage just next door spares consciousness LIS. It strongly supports the idea that the proto-self structures within that tiny region are indeed critical for maintaining consciousness. So, wrapping up this section, we've seen how distinguishing between core and extended consciousness helps us understand a range of fascinating phenomena, from the temporary memory lapses of TGA to the profound changes in self-awareness in Alzheimer's and the bizarre denial of illness in anosognosia. The proposed neuroanatomical framework, particularly emphasizing the role of the proto-self and the distributed networks of autobiographical memory, offers concrete hypotheses that seem to align well with clinical observations. Of course, science never stops, and much work remains to fully unravel these mysteries.